Sociolinguistics is essentially an empirical science, which means it relies on systematic observation and data collection. The goal is to study how language is actually used in social contexts to test ideas about how linguistic structures relate to social order. When designing research, we start with specific questions, like who speaks what language or dialect to whom, at what times, and for what reasons. This helps us focus our data collection efforts. Eliciting data can be tricky because of the observer's paradox. That's the challenge of observing how people naturally speak without them feeling like they're being studied. To get around this, we need to go beyond just theorizing in an armchair. Instead, we gather real-world facts through fieldwork, interviews, and observing conversations. This approach ensures that our claims are convincing and can be reproduced by others. Ultimately, our aim is to develop a well-grounded understanding of the communicative skills, what we call communicative competence, that people need to function effectively within their specific communities. All of this ties back to the broader theme of understanding language as a social tool, shaped by and shaping social structures. So, the fundamental unit we look at in sociolinguistics is called a sociolinguistic variable. Think of it as a linguistic item that has two or more variants, different ways of saying the same thing. For example, people might pronounce a word differently or use different grammatical structures, but all these variations serve the same communicative purpose. When researchers analyze these variables, they often focus on dependent variables, like phonetic realizations or grammatical choices. These are interesting because they tend to fluctuate depending on social factors. To understand these fluctuations, we compare them against independent variables. These are broader social categories like socioeconomic class, gender, age, or ethnicity. Now, within these variables, some are classified as markers. Markers show variation both socially and stylistically, meaning they change depending on social context and how formal or informal the situation is. On the other hand, indicators are variables that reflect social differences but aren't affected by the formality of the setting. And sometimes, certain variables become stereotypes. They're publicly discussed or stigmatized within a community, which can influence how people perceive and use those variations. All of this helps us understand how language varies across social groups and situations, which is really at the heart of sociolinguistics. Research in sociolinguistics can be broadly divided into two main orientations, quantitative and qualitative. The choice between them really depends on the research question you're asking. Quantitative, or variationist sociolinguistics, involves using statistical models to analyze large datasets. The goal here is to identify regular patterns in how language varies across different social groups. It's about finding the measurable trends and distributions. On the other hand, qualitative or ethnographic studies focus more on understanding communication within specific social contexts. These studies often involve participant observation and aim to uncover the local interactional rules that govern social interactions. They give us a detailed, nuanced picture of how language functions in particular settings. Then we have microlinguistic studies, which zoom in on specific linguistic items or individual differences. These studies can reveal insights with broader implications for understanding language use and cognition. Conversely, macrolinguistic studies take a much wider view. They draw conclusions about entire societies, often focusing on issues like language planning, policy, or societal language attitudes. Additionally, there's critical analysis, which examines how language contributes to power structures and social inequalities. This perspective is crucial because it highlights the social impact of language beyond just communication, showing us how language can reinforce or challenge social hierarchies. Bringing it all together, understanding the type of study helps us see the bigger picture of how language functions in society, whether we're looking at large-scale patterns or the detailed nuances of social interaction. Each approach offers unique insights that contribute to the overall understanding of language in social contexts. Let's take a look at the real-time and apparent-time frameworks. These are essential for understanding how language changes over time. When we study language change, we need different ways to track these innovations across periods. A real-time study involves comparing samples of speakers from two different points in history. For example, we might resurvey a community after 15 years and see how their language has evolved. This approach gives us a direct view of change as it happens over actual time. On the other hand, apparent time studies look at different generations within the same community at one moment. The key assumption here is that an individual's speech remains relatively stable after puberty. So, by comparing younger and older speakers, we can infer how language has changed across generations. This method allows us to observe what's called the S-curve of linguistic diffusion. That's where change begins slowly, then accelerates, and finally slows down again. It's a pattern we often see in how innovations spread through a community. And by analyzing these patterns alongside social variables, like age, socioeconomic status, or region, we can identify which subgroups are typically the innovators driving these changes. Understanding these frameworks helps us see not just that language changes, but also how and why it happens over time. The selection of speakers is a crucial step because it really influences how valid and generalizable our sociolinguistic findings are. Often, researchers steer away from strict random sampling and instead use judgment or quota sampling. This means they choose participants to represent specific demographic groups, like middle-aged married men, to ensure their study captures relevant variations. We also tend to look at speakers within speech communities that share common evaluative norms, or social networks that are defined by how often and how densely people interact in their daily lives. Some researchers focus on communities of practice, where the way people speak is coordinated around a shared activity or goal. More recently, especially in what's called third-wave studies, there's been a shift to viewing speakers as active agents. These individuals use their linguistic resources intentionally to perform and shape fluid social identities. So, when we're talking about the type of speaker, it's important to understand that their role isn't just passive. They actively construct their social identities through language. This perspective helps us see the bigger picture of how language functions in social life. Now, let's look at the different types of data collection procedures we use in sociolinguistics, which range along a continuum of formality. This helps us capture a variety of linguistic styles in different contexts. The most common method is the sociolinguistic interview, where we manipulate topics to encourage speakers to produce casual speech, more careful, or reading styles. This allows us to see how language varies depending on context and purpose. We also use rapid anonymous observations, which involve observing unmonitored speech in public spaces without the informant's knowledge. This technique ensures the data we collect is naturally occurring, giving us authentic insights into real-life language use. Another interesting approach is subjective reaction tests, like the matched guys technique. Here, we ask listeners to evaluate the personality traits of speakers using different language varieties. This helps us understand the underlying attitudes and perceptions within a community. Finally, we gather textual data from various sources such as government documents, emails, social media, and even public signage. These sources provide rich, contextual information about language use across different domains. All these methods, from interviews to observational and textual data, together form a comprehensive picture of linguistic variation. They're crucial for understanding how language functions in different social settings and how it reflects identity, attitude, and culture.